Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over.
This happened during the first cold snap of autumn. I had just moved into a small cottage on the outskirts of Lake Tahoe with my German Shepherd, Bear. He was a rescue dog I'd adopted 3 years ago. This big, gentle giant who'd been abandoned at a shelter, despite his intimidating size. He was usually the sweetest, most easygoing dog you'd ever meet. Usually, the cottage was my first real home after years of apartment living. It wasn't fancy, just a cozy 2-bedroom place surrounded by pine trees, but it had character with its wooden beams and stone fireplace. Being somewhat isolated didn't bother me. Bear's presence made me feel safe, and I'd installed a decent security system. That particular evening, I'd gotten home late from my job at the local veterinary clinic. It was already dark, and the temperature had dropped enough to see my breath in the air. After a quick walk with Bear around the property, I made some dinner and settled down at my desk to catch up on some work emails. Bear lay at my feet as usual while I worked, occasionally sighing contentedly. I must have lost track of time because when I finally looked up from my computer, it was nearly midnight. The house was dark except for my desk lamp, and the wind had picked up outside, making the old pine trees creak and groan. I decided to take Bear out for one last bathroom break before bed. The moment we stepped onto the back porch, his behavior changed. His ears perked up, and he became completely still. Something I'd never seen him do before. Then he let out a low growl, so quiet I almost missed it. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered, suddenly very aware of how dark it was beyond our porch light. Bear's eyes were fixed on something in the distance, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. We went back inside, but Bear wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing between the living room and the kitchen, occasionally stopping to stare intently at the windows. I tried to convince myself he was just picking up on the sounds of nocturnal animals, but something felt off. I was about to head to bed when I noticed something strange. My computer screen was reflecting the window behind me, and for a split second, I swear I saw movement outside. My heart started racing as I slowly turned around, but there was nothing there. Then Bear's head snapped toward the kitchen, and he let out another growl, deeper this time, more threatening. I'd never heard him make that sound before. I followed his gaze and froze. Through the kitchen window, I could clearly see a face staring in at us. The porch light caught just enough of their features to show a man, probably in his 40s, with hollow cheeks and dark eyes that seemed to bore right through me. The moment our eyes met, he ducked away from the window, Bear erupted into fierce barking, all his usual gentleness gone. I grabbed my phone and retreated to the living room, trying to dial 911 with shaking hands. That's when I heard it, the slight scraping sound of someone testing the back door handle. Bear was already there, his massive body planted firmly in front of the door, teeth bared and growling in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. Through the door's small window, I could see the man's silhouette. He was trying to peer in, probably trying to figure out if he could break in despite the dog. The 911 operator was asking me questions, but I could barely focus on answering. My eyes were fixed on that door, watching as the handle slowly turned. The lock held, but then I heard movement around the side of the house. He was checking other entry points. Bear followed the sounds, moving from window to window, his aggressive barking never letting up. At one point, we heard the distinct sound of breaking wood. He was trying to force open a window in my bedroom. Bear charged down the hallway, barking so ferociously that the whole house seemed to shake. That must have finally been enough to scare him off. By the time the police arrived 10 minutes later, he was gone. They found evidence of attempted entry at 3 different points around the house, including a partially broken window frame. More disturbing were the footprints in the soil around my house. He'd been circling the property for who knows how long before I noticed him. The police later linked the incident to a string of break-ins in the area, all targeting women living alone. In each case, the intruder had watched the houses for days, learning the occupants' routines. I realized with horror that he must have been watching me too, probably for weeks. I still live in the cottage, but I've added more security lights and cameras. Bear gets extra treats these days, and I pay very close attention when he acts unusual, sometimes at night, when the wind moves through the pines. I still think I see shadows moving outside my windows, but then Bear settles his head on my lap, completely relaxed, and I know we're safe, at least for now. My best friend Maria and I were spending a long weekend camping in Yosemite National Park. We'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to experience the park during its quietest season, late October, when most tourists had already gone home and the fall colors were at their peak. We found this amazing campsite through a hiking app. It was off the main tourist trail, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering sequoias. The spot was completely empty when we arrived, which wasn't surprising given the season and its remote location. The solitude was exactly what we were looking for after months of dealing with crowded city life. The first day was perfect. We hiked up to Eagle Peak, taking endless photos of the spectacular fall foliage. The maples and oaks were ablaze with red and gold, creating a stunning contrast against the dark green of the ancient sequoias. We got back to our campsite just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. That night, we sat around our campfire, sharing stories and making plans for the next day's hike. Maria was in the middle of telling me about her latest rock climbing adventure when we heard something moving in the woods. In the darkness beyond our fire's light, branches were cracking under heavy footsteps. "Hello," Maria called out, her voice steady but cautious. "Another camper out there." The footsteps stopped. Then from the darkness, a figure emerged, a man, probably in his 30s, wearing dark outdoor gear that looked too heavy for the mild weather. He was carrying a large backpack and had what looked like a hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Beautiful night for camping," he said, his voice oddly cheerful. He was standing just at the edge of our firelight, making it hard to see his face clearly. Something about how he was positioned made me deeply uncomfortable, like he was deliberately keeping his face in shadow. The man took a step closer, and now I could see his expression. He was smiling, but it never reached his eyes. Those remained cold, calculating, moving between us and our tent, where all our supplies were stored. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, already moving toward one of our camp chairs. "I've been walking for hours. Could use some company." Maria and I exchanged quick glances. We'd been friends long enough to read each other's signals, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. "Actually, we were just about to turn in," Maria said, her voice firm. "Early start tomorrow." The man's smile disappeared instantly. Without the fake friendliness, his face looked hard, almost predatory. He took another step forward, and now I could see he was gripping something in his right hand, partially hidden behind his leg. "That's not very hospitable," he said softly. "I thought campers were supposed to help each other out." Just then, we heard new voices approaching actual hikers coming down the trail, their headlamps bouncing through the trees. The man's head snapped toward the sound. When he looked back at us, his expression had changed completely. Now he looked angry, almost furious. Without another word, he backed away into the darkness. We could hear him moving through the underbrush, heading away from the trail and deeper into the woods. The other hikers, a group of 4 with proper camping gear, passed by a few minutes later, completely unaware of what had just happened. Maria and I didn't waste any time. We quickly doused the fire and packed up our essential gear, leaving the tent and some supplies behind. We hiked back to the main trail in the dark, using our headlamps and the light from our phones to guide us. Neither of us spoke much. We were too focused on listening for footsteps behind us. We made it to the ranger station around midnight. When we reported what happened, the ranger's face grew serious. Apparently, there had been several similar incidents in the park over the past few weeks. A man approaching solo campers or small groups, always at remote sites, always at night. two cases, camping gear had been stolen. In another, the campers reported that the man had become aggressive when they refused to share their food. They never caught him, as far as I know. The rangers increased their patrols, and the incidents eventually stopped. But sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity. These days, when I go camping, I stick to the popular, well-traveled areas. The solitude of those remote trails just doesn't seem worth the risk anymore. It happened the night after Christmas, when the magic of the holiday was starting to fade. But winter's grip was still tight around our neighborhood. I'd spent the day helping my elderly neighbors take down their decorations, and by early afternoon, exhaustion hit me hard. I decided to take a quick nap, setting no alarm since I had the whole week off work. The sound of my doorbell jolted me awake. My living room was completely dark, except for the soft blue glow of evening snow through the windows. I fumbled for my phone. 8:30 p.m. I'd slept way longer than intended, and now felt that peculiar disorientation that comes from sleeping through sunset. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Living in a small mountain town in Colorado, unexpected visitors weren't common, especially after dark. Through my window, I could see heavy snow falling, making the street lights look like hazy orbs in the darkness. I pulled on a sweater and made my way downstairs, still groggy from sleep. No one was visible through the peephole, which was strange given that my porch light was motion activated and definitely on. As I opened the door, the bitter cold hit me like a physical force. The porch was empty, but movement caught my eye. A figure standing near the old pine tree in my front yard. They were wearing what looked like traditional caroling attire. A long coat, scarf, and what appeared to be a top hat. But something was off about their posture. They stood completely still, head tilted slightly, staring directly at me through the falling snow. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The figure didn't respond or move, just kept staring. I was about to close the door when I heard its footsteps crunching in the snow, coming from the side of my house. My heart started racing as I realized there were more figures emerging from the darkness. They were all dressed similarly to the first one, but their clothes looked wrong somehow, too old-fashioned, too pristine in the heavy snow. "Look, if you're caroling, it's a bit late," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Maybe come back tomorrow." One of the figures took a step forward, and in the porch light, I could see their face, or rather, what should have been their face. Instead of normal features, there was something smooth and white, like a porcelain mask, but with no features at all, just a blank, oval surface. My whole body went cold. The figure by the tree started moving toward my porch with unnatural smoothness. as if gliding over the snow. The others followed, all moving in perfect unison. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran to the kitchen to grab my phone. Through the kitchen window, I could see more of them in my backyard, all wearing those same blank masks, all moving with that same terrifying grace. One was standing right outside the window, and as I watched, it pressed its featureless face against the glass. I ran upstairs and called 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. As I waited for them to arrive, I could hear movement all around my house, footsteps on the porch, scratching at the windows, the soft thud of hands pressing against the walls. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the quiet night. But by the time they pulled up, the figures were gone, leaving only a perfect circle of footprints around my house in the fresh snow. The officers searched the area, but found nothing. No tracks leading away from the circle. No signs of where they might have gone. The next day, my neighbors reported seeing strange lights in the woods behind our houses. And someone found old-fashioned buttons scattered in the snow near my driveway. But no one else had seen the figures themselves. I still live in the same house, but I've installed security cameras and motion lights everywhere. Sometimes, on snowy nights when the wind is still, I think I hear singing, distant, ethereal caroling that doesn't quite sound human. And every Christmas season, I find a single porcelain button on my doorstep, perfectly white against the snow, with no footprints leading to or from it. I started working the night shift at Memorial Drive Pharmacy just 2 months ago. It's one of those 24-hour medical centers on the outskirts of Boston, the kind that serves the local hospital staff and emergency patients. I just finished my pharmacy tech certification, and this was the only position available that offered enough pay to cover my student loans. That night was supposed to be like any other quiet, with the occasional nurse coming in for coffee or patients picking up late-night prescriptions. It was early December, and a thick fog had settled over the city, making the street lights look like distant, hazy orbs. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed steadily, creating that sterile, timeless atmosphere unique to places that never close. Around 2 a.m, I was organizing the inventory behind the counter when the automatic doors slid open. 3 people walked in, all wearing medical scrubs and surgical masks. At first glance, they looked like hospital staff. We got them all the time, but something felt off. Their scrubs were too clean, too crisp, like they'd just been taken out of the package. They split up immediately, each taking a different aisle. I could see them in the security mirrors mounted in the corners. They weren't actually looking at any products, just walking slowly, their heads turning in perfect synchronization, as if scanning the store. "Can I help you find anything?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The one nearest to me turned slowly. Through their surgical mask, I could see their eyes. They were an unnaturally pale blue, almost white. "We're just browsing," they said, their voice muffled and oddly flat. "We'll let you know when we need assistance." Something about their phrasing made my skin crawl. I reached for my phone under the counter, but before I could grab it, all three of them suddenly stopped moving. They stood completely still, heads tilted at identical angles, like they were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, as if responding to an unspoken signal, they all turned toward the pharmacy counter. Their movements were too coordinated, too smooth, like dancers in a choreographed performance. They began walking toward me, still perfectly in sync. "The pharmacy's closed," I said quickly, my hand finally finding my phone. "We only handle emergencies after midnight." The one in front pulled something from their pocket. It wasn't a prescription. It looked like a small, metallic device I'd never seen before. "We're not here for medication," they said, their voice now completely different, deeper, with an electronic undertone that no surgical mask could create. Just then, I heard a car pull into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the store windows. The three figures froze, their heads snapping toward the light in unison. Through the fog, I could make out the distinctive shape of a police cruiser, part of the regular patrol that checked on late-night businesses. The three figures moved with startling speed, heading for the emergency exit at the back of the store. As they passed under the security cameras, their scrubs seemed to shimmer and change color, like some kind of advanced camouflage. They disappeared into the fog before the police officer even entered the store. When I showed the security footage to the police later, all it showed was three blurry figures. The cameras had somehow failed to capture clear images of their faces or the strange device they'd carried. The officer who'd stopped by reported seeing nothing unusual in the area behind the store, not even footprints in the wet ground. The incident was written off as an attempted robbery, but I know it was something else. In the weeks that followed, other 24-hour pharmacies in the area reported similar visits. Always three figures in scrubs, always moving in perfect synchronization, always disappearing without a trace. Some say they were just skilled thieves targeting pharmacies. But I can't forget those unnaturally pale eyes, or the way their clothes seemed to change in the light. I still work the night shift, but now I keep the emergency alarm close and the police number ready to dial. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I think I see figures moving through it, their shapes distorting in impossible ways. On those nights, I'm grateful for every customer who comes in, every car that drives past, every reminder that I'm not alone in the darkness. The Northern Highway is famous among truck drivers for being one of the most isolated routes in North America. It stretches through endless miles of dense forest and mountains, with only occasional truck stops breaking up the monotony. I've been driving this route for 15 years, hauling cargo between Seattle and Anchorage. The isolation never bothered me. I actually preferred it to busy interstate highways. That night in late November, I was making my usual run north. The weather forecast had warned of an incoming storm, but I needed to make my delivery deadline. The first few hours were normal enough. Just me, my trusty Peterbilt, and the endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the wilderness. Around midnight, the snow started falling. Not the gentle kind, but heavy, thick flakes that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed 15 degrees and dropping. My truck's headlights could barely cut through the wall of white, and the few reflective markers along the road were becoming harder to spot. I knew I needed to find a place to wait out the worst of the storm. According to my GPS, there was a rest stop about 20 miles ahead. One of those basic ones with just a parking area and maybe some vending machines. As I drove on, the storm intensified and the wind picked up, howling around my cab like a living thing. That's when my radio crackled to life. At first, I thought it was just static, but then I heard a voice cutting through the white noise. "Anyone out there? We need assistance. Our vehicle is stuck." The voice was distorted, but clearly female. I picked up the mic. "This is Truck 473. What's your location?" "Thank goodness," the voice replied. "We're about a mile ahead, just off the highway. Please, we have children with us." Something about the transmission felt off. The static wasn't quite right, and the voice had an odd quality to it, like it was being played through an old record player. But the thought of kids stranded in this weather made me push my doubts aside. Soon enough, I saw lights off to the side of the road. What looked like hazard blinkers blinking through the snow. I slowed down, wondering if I could safely pull over without getting stuck myself. As I got closer, I could make out what appeared to be a minivan, partially buried in a snowdrift. I was about to stop when my headlights swept across the scene, and my blood ran cold. The van was old, very old, like something from the 1970s. Its hazard lights were on, but they weren't the modern LED type. They were old-style incandescent bulbs, and they were somehow working, despite the vehicle being partially crushed and covered in what looked like years of rust and decay. Standing around the van were figures. I couldn't tell how many. They were just dark shapes in the snow, but they all turned toward my truck in perfect unison as my lights hit them. That's when I noticed there were no footprints in the snow around them, despite the heavy drifts. My radio crackled again. "Please stop," the voice said. But now it was different, deeper, with an echo that made it sound like multiple voices speaking at once. The children are so cold. I pressed down on the accelerator hard. In my side mirror, I saw the figures moving, not walking or running, but gliding over the snow, following my truck. They were gaining on me, their shapes elongating impossibly as they moved. The radio erupted with voices, dozens of them now, all calling for help, all speaking in that same echoing tone. Through my mirrors, I could see more lights appearing along the road behind me. Old hazard lights blinking in the darkness, and more figures emerging from the snow. I drove for 20 straight minutes at speeds that would have got me fired any other day, not daring to slow down until I finally saw the lights of the rest stop ahead. As soon as I pulled in, the radio went silent, and my mirrors showed nothing but empty road behind me. The storm cleared by morning, and I continued my route. On my return trip, I checked the spot where I'd seen the van. There was nothing there, no vehicle, no tracks, nothing but untouched snow. But when I mentioned it to some other drivers at the next truck stop, their faces went pale. Apparently, in the 1970s, a family had gone missing on that stretch of highway during a snowstorm. Their van was never found. These days, I don't drive the northern highway at night anymore, especially during snowstorms. Sometimes when I'm in my cab and the radio picks up static, I think I hear voices in the white noise calling for help, but I never answer and I never stop. Some things are better left alone in the darkness. I took the night manager position at the historic Windsor Hotel last November, built in 1896. It's one of those grand old buildings you find in small New England towns, all red brick and elaborate cornices, with a reputation for being hauntingly beautiful. Emphasis on haunting. The hotel was running on a skeleton crew during the off-season, with just me and a maintenance worker named Eddie handling the night shift. Most of our guests were business travelers who'd stumbled across us on booking websites, unaware of the building's history or its peculiarities. The night everything happened started normally enough. It was a quiet Tuesday, with only 8 rooms occupied, all on the second floor. Outside, a bitter wind was rattling the original Victorian windows, and an early winter storm was rolling in from the coast. Around 2 a.m, I was doing my usual rounds, checking the grand lobby with its towering Christmas tree we just put up. The antique chandelier cast strange shadows across the marble floor, and the old radiators were making their usual pinging sounds as they heated. That's when I heard it music, not the subtle background music we played in the lobby, but something else. It sounded like it was coming from the grand ballroom, a space we only used for special events. The melody was faint, but distinct. An old waltz played on what sounded like a slightly out-of-tune piano. I called Eddie on the radio. "Hey, is someone in the ballroom?" Negative, his voice crackled back. That whole wing is locked up for the season. I made my way down the corridor toward the ballroom, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The music got clearer as I approached, definitely a waltz, played with surprising skill. But our ballroom's piano had been removed months ago for restoration. When I reached the ballroom doors, the music stopped abruptly. The keys were still in my hand, but I could see light spilling out from under the door. A warm, flickering glow like gaslight. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The ballroom was dark and empty, except it wasn't quite empty. In the dim light from the corridor, I could see what looked like frost patterns on the hardwood floor, elaborate swirling designs that matched the path dancers would take during a waltz, and they were fresh, slowly melting before my eyes. My radio crackled, making me jump. "Everything okay down there?" Eddie asked. Before I could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the air, and the frost patterns on the floor began to spread, crawling up the walls like living things. Then I heard it, the soft swish of fabric and the subtle click of shoes on hardwood. But I couldn't see anyone. The chandeliers above suddenly blazed to life, though I knew for a fact they weren't connected to power anymore. The room was filled with a golden glow, and in that light, I saw them, transparent figures, spinning across the floor in elaborate Victorian dress. They were like heat mirages, barely visible, but clearly moving in time to music I could no longer hear. I backed away toward the door, but my movement seemed to catch their attention. The figures stopped their dance, and one by one they turned to face me. Their faces were indistinct except for their eyes, which looked like burning coals in the ghostly light. Then one of them spoke. A woman's voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "You're just in time for the winter ball," she said, extending a transparent hand toward me. "We've been waiting so long for a new partner." I ran. I don't remember making the conscious decision to move, but suddenly I was sprinting down the corridor, the sound of ethereal laughter echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the front desk, where Eddie found me a few minutes later, white as a sheet. Together we checked the ballroom again, but it was back to normal dark, cold, and empty. The frost patterns were gone, and the chandeliers were as dead as they'd been for years. But when we looked closer at the floor, we found something impossible, dozens of footprints in the dust, all following the precise steps of a Victorian waltz. The next day, I started researching the hotel's history. In 1920, the annual winter ball had ended in tragedy when a fire broke out. Dozens of guests were trapped in the ballroom. The hotel was rebuilt, but according to local legend, those guests never left. I still work at the Windsor, but I don't do rounds alone anymore. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, Guests report hearing faint music from the ballroom wing. We tell them it's just the wind in the old pipes, but I know better. And when I pass the ballroom doors, I walk quickly, ignoring the sound of waltzing feet and the occasional invitation to join the eternal dance. It was my first year volunteering with the Angel Tree Foundation, a charity that delivers Christmas gifts to underprivileged kids. I was 13, and my 3 best friends, Daniel, Katie, and Marcus, had all signed up together. We thought it would be a fun way to spread some holiday cheer while earning community service credits for school. The foundation had paired us with an experienced volunteer named Mrs. Patterson, a silver-haired woman who'd been doing this for 20 years. She drove us in her minivan, and we spent the afternoon delivering presents to families in the suburbs. As the sun started setting, she checked her list and announced we had just one more stop. "It's a bit out of the way," she said, turning onto a road I didn't recognize. The Henderson family. They just moved here, and their application came in late, but we couldn't bear to leave them out. We drove further from the city, the houses becoming more sparse. The winter sky was darkening quickly, and heavy clouds threatened snow. Katie and Daniel were in the back seat, sorting through the last few wrapped presents, while Marcus sat next to me, playing with his phone's GPS. "That's weird," he whispered. "We're not showing up on the map anymore." Before I could look, Mrs. Patterson turned onto a narrow road that disappeared into dense woods. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches scraping against the van's windows. After about 10 minutes, we emerged into a clearing where a single house stood, a massive Victorian mansion that looked like it had been abandoned for years. "This can't be right," Katie said, her voice uncertain. "Are you sure this is the address?" Mrs. Patterson just smiled in the rearview mirror. "Oh yes, dear. The Hendersons are expecting us." She parked in front of the house, and that's when I noticed something odd. There were no other tire tracks in the fresh snow covering the driveway. If a family had just moved in, where were their vehicles? "Let's get these presents delivered," Mrs. Patterson said cheerfully, but something had changed in her voice. It had a hollow quality now, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. We grabbed the gifts and followed her up to the front porch. The wood creaked beneath our feet, and up close, I could see that all the windows were dark, not just unlit, but completely black, as if they opened into absolute darkness. Mrs. Patterson knocked on the door, and it swung open immediately. No one was behind it. "Hello," she called out, stepping inside. "The Angel Tree Foundation is here." The interior was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, nothing but dust and cobwebs. The wallpaper was peeling, and there were leaves scattered across the floor, as if no one had been inside for decades. Mrs. Patterson I don't think anyone lives here, Marcus said, his voice shaking. She turned to face us, and we all took a step back. Her face had changed. It was gaunt now, with deep shadows under her eyes that seemed to swallow all light. "Oh, but they do," she said, her smile growing impossibly wide. "The Hendersons have lived here for a very long time. They're always looking for new friends to join their Christmas celebration." Suddenly, we heard children's laughter echoing from upstairs, high-pitched and unnatural. Shadows began moving across the walls, forming shapes that looked like people, but were wrong somehow. Too tall and too thin. "Run," Daniel shouted, dropping the presents. We bolted for the door, but it slammed shut on its own. The laughter was getting closer, and now we could hear footsteps on the stairs, dozens of them, though the staircase was empty. Katie spotted a window and smashed it with a wrapped present. We scrambled through, ignoring the broken glass, and ran toward the van. But Mrs. Patterson was already there, though we'd left her inside. She stood by the driver's door, her form flickering like a bad television signal. "The Hendersons will be so disappointed," she said, her voice now a chorus of whispers. "They've been so lonely since they all froze to death in the blizzard of 1947. They just want some children to play with." Marcus had his phone out, already dialing 911. The moment he raised it, all the shadows around us surged forward, and the temperature dropped so low it hurt to breathe. But then we heard it, sirens in the distance. The shadows retreated, and Mrs. Patterson's form began to fade. "Perhaps next year," she said, her voice growing distant. "The Hendersons are very patient." When the police arrived, they found us huddled together in the snow. The house was still there, but Mrs. Patterson and the van were gone. Later investigation revealed that the real Mrs. Patterson had retired from the Angel Tree Foundation 5 years ago. The woman we'd spent the afternoon with matched the description of the original owner of the house, who had disappeared along with several children during a Christmas gift drive in 1947. They say the house was demolished the following spring. But every Christmas, local kids swear they see lights in the woods where it stood, and hear the sound of children laughing. Sometimes, they say, a kind-looking old woman in an outdated dress appears at charity events, offering to help deliver presents to families who don't seem to exist. I took the security job at Paradise Bay Water Park during its off-season shutdown. The place had closed for winter renovations, and they needed someone to watch over the equipment and prevent vandalism. The pay was decent, and the job seemed simple enough. Just patrol the empty park from 8 at night until dawn. Paradise Bay was one of those massive water parks built in the early 90s, with towering slides and a giant wave pool. But after 20 years of operation, it was showing its age. The once bright colors had faded to ghostly pastels, and the artificial palm trees were shedding their plastic fronds. My first few nights were uneventful. I'd make my rounds through the empty park, checking the perimeter and listening to the constant hum of the maintenance pumps that kept the pipes from freezing. The only real challenge was getting used to how different everything looked at night. The massive slides cast strange shadows under the security lights, creating twisted shapes that sometimes looked like reaching hands or crouching figures. It was during my third week when things started getting weird. I was doing my midnight round when I heard splashing coming from the wave pool. Not the usual sound of water sloshing against the sides, but the distinct sound of someone swimming. I rushed over, expecting to find teenagers who'd broken in for a midnight swim. But when I reached the pool, the water was perfectly still. The security lights reflected off its surface like a mirror. Not a single ripple in sight, yet I could still hear the splashing, now coming from the other end of the pool. I walked around the edge, my flashlight beam dancing across the water. The splashing sounds moved with me, always staying just out of sight. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were wet footprints on the concrete, leading away from the pool. But they weren't normal footprints. They seemed to appear on their own, one after another, as if invisible feet were walking across the deck. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Through bursts of static, I heard what sounded like children laughing, but it was wrong somehow. The laughter had an echo to it, like it was coming from underwater. I backed away from the pool, but the footprints kept appearing, now moving in my direction. The radio laughter got louder, mixed with what sounded like someone trying to speak through water. I turned and ran toward the security office. As I passed the locker rooms, all the showers suddenly turned on at full blast. Steam began pouring out into the corridor, and in that mist, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There were figures moving in the steam, children in swimsuits from another era, their forms transparent and distorted. I finally made it back to the security office and slammed the door. On the monitor showing the wave pool, I could see ripples moving across the water, as if someone was swimming laps. But the other monitors showed something even more terrifying, dark shapes sliding down the water slides. Even though the water had been drained months ago, the temperature in the office dropped dramatically, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The radio on my desk burst to life again, but this time a single voice came through clearly. "Won't you come swim with us? The water's perfect." I sat there, frozen, watching the monitors as more and more figures appeared, all children, all slightly transparent, all moving in ways that defied physics. They were sliding down dry slides, diving into empty pools, and walking through solid walls. Around 3 in the morning, everything suddenly stopped. The showers turned off, The radio went silent, and the monitors showed only empty pools and slides. But when I finally worked up the courage to do another round, I found all the pools had a thin layer of water in them, despite having been drained that morning. The next day, I started researching the park's history. In 1994, during its first year of operation, 3 children had gone missing here. They were never found, but witnesses reported seeing them heading toward the wave pool after closing time. I still work at Paradise Bay, but I'm not alone anymore. The company hired a second guard after I threatened to quit. On quiet nights, we still hear splashing and laughter echoing through the empty park. Sometimes, on the security cameras, we catch glimpses of children playing in impossible ways, swimming through air, walking up the sides of slides, or disappearing into thin air. The renovation work was supposed to finish months ago, but strange accidents keep delaying it. Tools disappear, only to be found at the bottom of drained pools. Workers report feeling invisible hands pushing them away from certain areas. And every morning, no matter how thoroughly we drain the wave pool, there's always a small puddle of water in the deep end, rippling gently as if someone just finished swimming. In 2019, I embarked on what would become the most unsettling adventure of my life. As a wildlife photographer, I was always searching for unique locations to capture nature's raw beauty. That's how I stumbled upon information about an abandoned weather station perched high in the mountains, about 5 hours from my home. The station had been decommissioned over a decade ago, and while it wasn't exactly legal to explore it, online forums suggested it was still structurally sound. The last post I could find was from 3 years ago, so I knew I was taking a chance. After packing my camera gear, 2 days' worth of supplies, and my trustworthy satellite GPS, I set out on this ambitious expedition. I found a small clearing where I could safely park my truck, hidden from the main road. The hike ahead was challenging. No marked trails led to the station, just pure wilderness. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as I ascended, with loose rocks and thick vegetation slowing my progress. My backpack felt heavier with each step, but the thought of capturing sunset photos from that elevation kept me going. After 5 exhausting hours of climbing, I finally caught sight of the weather station. It was a stark silhouette against the afternoon sky, sitting atop the rocky outcrop like a forgotten sentinel. As I got closer, I could see that while the paint had long since peeled away, the main structure appeared surprisingly stable. The metal support beams showed minimal rust, and when I tested them with my weight, they held firm. The steel ladder leading up to the station creaked ominously with each step, but it too proved reliable. When I reached the top, I was momentarily stunned by the vista before me. Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks piercing through wispy clouds. No signs of civilization were visible, just pure, untamed wilderness. The station itself was a single room, roughly 14 feet by 14 feet. Broken scientific instruments lay scattered across an old wooden desk, and a deteriorating cot occupied one corner. The windows, though grimy, remained mostly intact, offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding peaks. I set up my camping gear and prepared a simple meal while watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. As darkness settled in, heavy clouds rolled in, obscuring both moon and stars. I sat outside on the narrow walkway, enjoying the absolute solitude, until something caught my eye. A strange light moved through the trees below. Unlike the white beam of a flashlight, this light had an eerie orange glow, flickering like a torch. It weaved between the trees, following no apparent path. The chances of encountering another person here, especially at night, seemed impossibly small. Even stranger was their choice of lighting. Who would use a torch instead of a modern flashlight? I watched, transfixed, as the light danced through the forest for several minutes before disappearing behind a rocky outcropping. 30 minutes passed with no further sign of it. The mountain air had grown chilly, and I was just about to head inside when I glanced down at the base of the station. A figure stood there, barely visible in the darkness, looking directly up at me. My heart began racing. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the mountain silence. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, they raised one hand in an odd, almost apologetic gesture before turning and walking into the darkness without a light. Despite my unease, I tried to rationalize the encounter. Perhaps it was another photographer or hiker, checking if the station was occupied, but something about their silence and that strange gesture left me deeply unsettled. I retreated inside, trying to calm my nerves. The wind had picked up, making the old building creak and groan. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my anxiety, and I drifted off to sleep. I'm not sure how long I slept before the sound woke me. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence broken only by a rhythmic metallic creaking. My blood ran cold as I realized what it was. Someone was climbing the ladder. Each slow, deliberate step produced a distinct creak in the metal rungs. Grabbing my backpack and flashlight, I moved toward the walkway. The creaking grew louder and faster, as if whoever was climbing had suddenly accelerated their pace. Just as I stepped outside, the sound stopped abruptly. Heart pounding, I crept toward the ladder. When I peered over the edge, the ladder was empty. Before I could process this, rapid footsteps thundered around the walkway behind me. I caught a glimpse of a dark figure sprinting past the windows. Without hesitation, I scrambled onto the ladder, and began climbing down as quickly as I dared. The wet metal was treacherous, and my hands shook violently. Halfway down, I heard movement above me and looked up to see a shadowy head peering over the edge. I practically jumped the remaining distance, my legs nearly buckling upon landing. Guided by my GPS and flashlight, I ran through the darkness, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over rocks. Whether I was followed or not, I'll never know. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. The drive home was a blur of adrenaline and relief. To this day, I can't explain what happened up there. All my camera gear made it back with me, though I never did get the sunset photos I'd hoped for. Sometimes I think about going back during daylight hours, but deep down, I know I never will. Some places are better left unexplored, their mysteries kept hidden in the darkness of the mountains. As a geologist, I've explored countless remote locations, but this particular site was special. Hidden away in the mountains was a small plateau with a cascading waterfall, a perfect location for studying rock formations. It wasn't marked on any official maps, and the only way to reach it was through a narrow, overgrown path that my grandfather had shown me years ago. What was meant to be a routine weekend of field research turned into something I still struggle to explain. The first day went exactly as planned. I arrived early, set up my camp near the waterfall, and spent hours collecting rock samples and documenting the geological layers exposed by the water's erosion. The sound of the falling water created a peaceful backdrop as I worked, and the isolation felt comforting rather than concerning. I'd been coming to this spot for years, both as a child with my grandfather and later alone as a researcher. Never once had I encountered another person here, nor even seen evidence of other visitors. The place felt like a secret handed down through my family, preserved and untouched by the outside world. The second day started normally enough. I spent the morning walking the perimeter of the plateau, making notes about the rock formations. The waterfall created a constant mist that kept the surrounding vegetation lush and green. Despite the rocky terrain, I must have circled the area 4 or 5 times, each lap revealing new details worth documenting. Then something caught my eye that made me stop in my tracks. Near the edge of the tree line, where the dense forest met the rocky plateau, I noticed something that hadn't been there during my previous passes. Footprints in the damp soil. But these weren't ordinary footprints left by hiking boots or walking shoes. These were bare footprints, as if someone had been walking completely barefoot across the rough terrain. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp and undisturbed by the constant mist from the waterfall. They led from the forest to the edge of the plateau, where they stood facing the waterfall, before turning and heading straight back into the woods. The strangest part was that I had walked this exact spot less than an hour ago, and they definitely hadn't been there then. A deep sense of unease settled over me. Had someone been watching me as I made my rounds? Why would anyone be out here barefoot, especially on such rocky ground? The rational part of my mind tried to find logical explanations, but each theory seemed less plausible than the last. I returned to my campsite, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, I found myself scanning the tree line, expecting to see someone staring back at me. As darkness fell, I built up my campfire, hoping the light and warmth would help calm my nerves. The sun had been down for perhaps an hour when I heard footsteps approaching from the forest. Not just one person, but two sets of footsteps moving in perfect synchronization. They emerged from the darkness into the edge of my firelight. A man and woman standing side by side. Their appearance made my blood run cold. They were dressed in what looked like clothing from another century. The woman in a long, dark dress that reached her ankles. The man in an old-fashioned suit with a high collar. Both outfits were immaculate, showing no signs of having traveled through the rough terrain. Neither wore any shoes, their bare feet pale against the dark ground. "Can I help you?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding strange in the night air. The woman immediately turned and disappeared into the darkness with impossible speed, while the man remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on me. I asked again if he needed help, but he simply turned and walked away with the same deliberate movements as their arrival. That was all it took for me to decide this trip was over. I'm an experienced outdoorsman, but something about their appearance and behavior felt fundamentally wrong. I packed up my gear in record time, hardly caring about organization. My hands shook as I extinguished the fire and hoisted my backpack. The 2-hour hike back to my truck became a nightmare. Every few minutes, I heard running footsteps in the darkness around me, sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right, always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything when I shined my flashlight toward the sound. The footsteps were oddly quiet, as if muffled the sound of bare feet on forest ground. The pattern continued moments of tense silence, broken by the sound of running feet, moving parallel to my path, but never quite visible. Each time the sound came closer, and each time my heart felt like it would burst from my chest. What made it worse was the complete absence of other forest sounds. No insects, no nocturnal animals, just those phantom footsteps and my own labored breathing. Somehow, I made it back to my truck. As I drove away, I checked my rearview mirror obsessively, but saw no other vehicles or figures on the road. I filed a report with the local rangers the next day, but they found nothing unusual when they checked the area. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe they were survivalists, or members of some obscure religious group. Maybe the isolation and darkness played tricks on my mind, but deep down, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever I encountered that night wasn't entirely human. I haven't returned to the plateau since then, and I doubt I ever will. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. I'm Emma, a 27-year-old wildlife photographer based out of northern Alaska. For the past 3 years, I've lived on the road in my modified four-wheel drive, documenting the untamed wilderness and its inhabitants. I've converted an old Land Rover Defender into a cozy mobile home, complete with a sleeping platform, solar panels, and all my photography equipment. Many people choose different approaches to life on the road. Some prefer crowded campgrounds or urban areas, but I've always felt safest in the backcountry. There's something deeply peaceful about being miles away from civilization, surrounded only by nature, while some might find the isolation unsettling. I've learned that you're usually safer in the wilderness than in a busy parking lot trying to sleep unnoticed. That particular week, I was exploring a remote region of Alaska, taking my time on the backroads between assignments. I'd been commissioned to photograph wild caribou migrations, which meant venturing into increasingly isolated areas. The weather was typical for early spring, intermittent rain, and gray skies that made the wilderness feel even more removed from civilization. I turned onto a narrow dirt track that disappeared into the dense forest. There were a few smaller pullouts along the way, all empty, and the trail showed no recent tire tracks. This suggested I'd have the area to myself, exactly how I preferred it. I continued deeper into the woods, hoping to find a larger space at the end of the trail. The track opened into a spacious clearing, complete with an old fire ring in the center. Perfect. I carefully leveled my Defender using the built-in hydraulic system and settled in for the evening. Spring in Alaska meant near constant rain, so I didn't bother setting up my outdoor equipment. Instead, I opened the rear door to let in fresh air while I prepared dinner on my compact propane stove. As sunset approached, the rain intensified, drumming steadily against the vehicle's roof. I closed the door, but left one of the small rear windows cracked for ventilation. I was reviewing the day's photos on my laptop when a reflection suddenly appeared on my screen. A beam of light coming through the rear window. Before I could turn around, the light vanished, not gradually moving away, but suddenly switching off. I slowly turned to look out the window, but saw only darkness and rain. The light hadn't come from the direction of the access trail. It had come from deep within the forest where no vehicles could go. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another photographer or hunter with a flashlight. But something about the sudden appearance and disappearance felt deliberate, calculated. The rain intensified, making it nearly impossible to distinguish any sounds from outside. Occasionally, I thought I heard movement, branches snapping or leaves rustling, but the rain made it impossible to be certain. Each time I peered out the windows, I saw nothing but darkness, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. Around 11, I decided to try to sleep. I turned off all my equipment, closed the windows, and pulled down the blackout shades I'd installed. The darkness inside the vehicle was almost complete, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. Sleep proved elusive as the storm grew stronger, thunder now joining the constant drumming of rain. 2 hours passed in this state of restless alertness when I heard a distinct movement outside, too deliberate to be an animal. It sounded like someone running, their feet hitting the wet ground and snapping a branch. Then silence, save for the rain. My heart began racing as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. Suddenly, a male voice broke through the sound of rain, not shouting, but loud enough to be heard, as if speaking to someone else nearby. I remained frozen, not daring to look out the windows. If they hadn't seen movement or light from inside, they might think the vehicle was empty. Minutes stretched by with no sound except the storm. Then I heard it, the distinct sound of someone leaning against my vehicle's side door, the metal creaking slightly under their weight. A knock followed, then another. I held my breath, hoping they'd move on. After several minutes of intermittent knocking, a voice called out, "Forest Service." "Open up." My blood ran cold. I knew every Forest Service vehicle within 50 miles. They all used marked white trucks and never patrolled this deep in the backcountry at night, especially not in this weather. The knocking continued, becoming more insistent. The voice called out again, now claiming to be state police, then park rangers. Each claim made it more obvious this was someone trying to get me to open my door through a small gap in my window covering. I could make out at least 2 figures moving around my vehicle. Their shapes were wrong for any kind of law enforcement. No gear, no uniforms, just dark silhouettes in the rain. Making a split-second decision, I crawled into the driver's seat. As I turned the key, I heard multiple sets of footsteps rushing toward my vehicle. A face appeared briefly in my side window, just as I accelerated. My 4-wheel drive system handling the slick ground with ease. As I sped down the trail, my headlights never revealed another vehicle. I later learned from local authorities that there had been reports of poachers in the area, targeting protected wildlife under cover of darkness. No officers had been patrolling that section of forest that night. I never got any follow-up about who they might have been, but I can guess their intentions weren't good. The incident hasn't stopped me from living on the road or pursuing wildlife photography, but it taught me to be more cautious about my camping locations, and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. The wilderness is still where I feel most at home, but I never forget that the most dangerous predators sometimes walk on two legs. I'm a 25-year-old Australian, and last September, my family and I embarked on what was supposed to be an unforgettable hiking adventure in Banff National Park. The four of us had flown halfway across the world to experience the raw beauty of the Canadian wilderness. My sister Emma, always glued to her phone back home, was finally looking up at the world around her. Dad, a seasoned photographer, couldn't stop talking about capturing the perfect shot of the legendary Canadian wildlife. Mom, well, she was just happy we were all together. We'd spent a week exploring the easier trails when we decided to join a guided hike to Cascade Peak. The morning started crystal clear, with that crisp mountain air that makes you feel more alive than ever. Our guide, James, was this weathered mountain man who'd spent 20 years navigating these trails. He kept pointing out things we'd never notice: fresh animal tracks, rare alpine flowers, and signs of changing weather patterns. Being from Australia, where our most dangerous encounters might be with angry kangaroos or venomous snakes, we were all fascinated by James's stories about the local wildlife. How many moose are there in Banff? I asked during one of our breaks. About 400, he replied. And it's rutting season, so the bulls are particularly aggressive. I nodded, thinking how different this was from the outback. After hiking for about 4 hours, we reached a viewpoint that left us speechless. The valley stretched out below us, pristine and untouched, with emerald lakes dotting the landscape like jewels. My family wanted to rest, but I couldn't resist exploring further. James mentioned a magnificent viewpoint just a mile ahead, perfect for photography. Despite my mother's concerned look, I decided to push forward alone. The trail became narrower as I climbed higher, winding through dense pine forest before opening into alpine meadows. The solitude was intoxicating. I'd hiked through the Australian outback, explored New Zealand's backcountry, but this was different. The landscape had an ancient, primordial feel to it. Everything changed when I heard the first branch snap. I froze, remembering James's warnings about wildlife. Through the trees, I saw movement: a massive bull moose, easily 7 feet tall at the shoulder, with antlers spanning 6 feet across. My heart stopped. The creature stood there, pawing the ground, steam rising from its nostrils in the cool air. I slowly backed away, remembering the wildlife safety briefing. The moose lowered its head, showing off its impressive rack of antlers. Then it charged. The ground shook with each thundering step. I had mere seconds to react. The trail was too narrow to run straight, so I dove behind a large boulder, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The moose crashed past, its antlers scraping against the rock where I'd been standing seconds before. I scrambled up and ran, not daring to look back. The sound of breaking branches and heavy breathing behind me told me everything I needed to know. It was coming back for another charge. I sprinted through the forest, ducking under branches and leaping over fallen logs. My lungs burned in the thin mountain air. I could hear the moose gaining on me, its hooves pounding the earth like drums. In desperation, I veered off the trail and down a steep slope, using small trees to control my descent. The moose's bulk worked against it on the steep terrain, but I could still hear it crashing through the forest above me. I ran until my legs felt like lead, until I finally spotted the main trail below. With one final burst of energy, I made it to the trail just as a group of hikers came around the bend. Their shouts and movements finally convinced the moose to retreat. I collapsed on the trail, gasping for air, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. The hiking group helped me back to the ranger station, where I found my worried family waiting. The rangers weren't surprised by my story. Bull moose are incredibly territorial this time of year, they explained while documenting the incident. You're lucky you kept your head and knew to use the terrain to your advantage. Looking back now, I realize how naive I'd been. I'd traveled the world, faced my share of dangers, but nothing had prepared me for the raw power of a charging moose. My family still brings up the story at gatherings, though Mom uses it as a cautionary tale about wandering off alone. That day taught me something crucial about wilderness. It demands respect, regardless of how experienced you think you are. The Canadian Rockies aren't just beautiful, they're wild in a way that can humble you in an instant. I still hike and explore, but now I carry a deeper appreciation for the power of nature and the importance of heeding local warnings. The ancient peaks of the Romanian Carpathians loomed before me as I made my way up the winding mountain trail. I'd spent years climbing in the Alps, but there was something different about these mountains. The locals in the last village had crossed themselves when I mentioned hiking alone, muttering something about the forbidden peaks and the shepherd's curse. The trail wound through dense forests of black pine, their branches creaking in the autumn wind. Weathered wooden crosses occasionally appeared along the path, adorned with faded ribbons and mysterious carvings. I'd been climbing for about 2 hours when I first noticed him, a figure moving faster than any local shepherd should, cutting across the switchbacks with unnatural ease. At first, I thought nothing of it. The mountains here were dotted with sheep camps, and shepherds knew these paths better than any hiking map could show. But something about his movement seemed off, too fluid, too precise, like someone imitating human movement rather than moving naturally. He caught up to me near a weather-beaten shepherd's hut, its wooden walls darkened by centuries of harsh weather. Instead of passing by, he matched my pace. "Good day," he said, in heavily accented English, his voice carrying an odd, hollow quality. He wore traditional shepherds, clothing wool vest, rough pants, and a weather-beaten hat pulled low over his eyes. But everything looked too clean, too new for someone who lived in the mountains. The conversation that followed made my skin crawl. He spoke about the mountains as if they were living beings, about how nothing felt challenging anymore, how the peaks had lost their power to thrill him. His words seemed rehearsed, like he was reciting lines from a play he'd watched, but hadn't quite understood. "The sheep no longer fear the wolves," he said, his face twisting into an unnatural smile. Perhaps they should. Something in his eyes seemed to shift as he said this, becoming darker, more vacant. I made an excuse about needing to rest, hoping he'd continue on his way. He did, disappearing around a bend in the trail with that same unnaturally fluid movement. The rest of my hike was magnificent. I found a perfect camping spot on a rocky outcrop overlooking a deep valley, the kind of view that makes you feel small in the best possible way. As night fell, the mountains took on a different character. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying sounds that seemed almost like words in a language I couldn't quite understand. I'm not usually one for superstition, but something about this place made me uneasy. I placed my survival knife within easy reach before settling down to sleep under the stars. I slept deeply, too deeply for someone alone in the mountains. When I woke, the world felt wrong. The morning was too quiet, the birds too still. I reached for my backpack to start preparing breakfast, and that's when I noticed it. Every single pocket was open, every zipper undone, every clasp unclipped, every compartment exposed to the morning air. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but someone or something had systematically opened every closure on my pack. My knife lay beside my sleeping pad, exactly where I'd left it, but the snap that secured it to its sheath had been undone. The metal gleamed in the early morning light, as if it had been polished. I've spent enough time in the mountains to know when they're telling you to leave. I packed up camp in record time, not even bothering to organize my gear properly. As I hurried down the trail, I could have sworn I heard that hollow voice carried on the wind, reciting what sounded like an old shepherd's prayer. The locals in the village below weren't surprised when I told them where I'd camped. The old woman at the small grocery store nodded knowingly. "The shepherd watches his flock," she said in broken German. "Sometimes his flock is not sheep." She refused to elaborate further. I've climbed many mountains since then, but I've never returned to that particular region of the Carpathians. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows just right, I remember that unnatural smile and those methodically opened pockets. The mountains hold many secrets, and some of them are better left undisturbed. The Mekong River stretched before us like a brown serpent, its waters swollen from the monsoon rains. I'd spent the last 2 weeks documenting wildlife along its banks with my friend Chris, our small wooden boat becoming our home as we navigated the remote waterways of northern Laos. The locals in the last fishing village had warned us about venturing this far upriver, especially during the rainy season. They spoke in whispers about a massive tiger that had developed a taste for human flesh. That night, the jungle was alive with sound cicadas creating their endless symphony, accompanied by the occasional deep rumble of thunder in the distance. We'd moored our boat against a fallen tree, setting up camp on a small elevated bank. The air was thick with humidity, making everything feel heavy and damp. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to relieve myself. Chris was sound asleep in his hammock, the mosquito netting creating a ghostly silhouette in the dim moonlight. I grabbed my flashlight and walked a short distance from camp, the mud squishing beneath my boots. The river gurgled nearby, its brown waters reflecting the scattered moonlight that pierced through the canopy. That's when I heard it, a sharp crack of breaking bamboo. My heart jumped into my throat. Years of wildlife photography had taught me to recognize different animal sounds. But this was deliberate, heavy. I stood perfectly still, my breath caught in my lungs. Another crack, closer this time. I slowly turned my head toward the sound, and there it was, a massive Bengal tiger, its striped coat gleaming in the moonlight. It was less than 20 feet away, crouched low, its muscles rippling beneath its wet fur. The locals had called it Phai Sua, the ghost tiger, and now I understood why. It moved like a spirit, almost silent despite its enormous size. Our eyes met, and time seemed to stop. Those amber eyes held centuries of primal fear, triggering something deep in my DNA that screamed, "Run." But I knew better. I'd photographed big cats before, though never this close, never this exposed. The tiger's ears flicked forward, and I could see its whiskers trembling as it tested the air. It moved closer, each step calculated. I could smell its musky scent now, mixed with the petrichor from the recent rain. My mind raced through everything I knew about tiger behavior. But this was different. This wasn't a curious cat. It was hunting. Suddenly it charged. I don't remember deciding to move. My body just reacted. I dove behind a massive buttress root as the tiger sailed past, its roar shaking the very air around me. The sound echoed off the river, drowning out even the thunder that was growing closer. I ran, not toward camp. I couldn't lead it there, but parallel to the river. The tiger pursued, its powerful strides eating up the distance between us. Rain began to fall, making the ground treacherous. I slipped and scrambled through the undergrowth, thorns tearing at my clothes. The tiger was toying with me. It would disappear for moments, then crash through the vegetation nearby, hurting me like prey. My lungs burned from the humid air, and my legs trembled with each step. I could hear Chris shouting in the distance, but his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere in the maze of trees and rain. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark white. The tiger was right there, less than 10 feet away, its coat now slick with rain. It rose onto its hind legs, placing its massive paws against a tree trunk. In that moment, it looked more like a mythical creature than a real animal. Another flash revealed empty space. It had vanished like smoke. I made it back to camp, my clothes soaked with rain and mud. Chris was there, with a machete in one hand, and our emergency flare gun in the other. We spent the rest of the night in the boat, listening to the tiger circling our camp. Its roars mixed with the thunder, creating an otherworldly chorus that I'll never forget. At dawn, we found its tracks in the mud, massive paw prints that could only belong to a male tiger of exceptional size. What haunted me most were the patterns of the tracks. It had circled our camp multiple times, coming close enough to touch the boat at points. The local fishermen weren't surprised by our story. Vaisua knows this river better than we do. An old man told us through our interpreter. He decides who can stay and who must go. We packed up that morning and headed downstream, the weight of those amber eyes following us all the way back to civilization. I photographed dangerous animals all over the world, but nothing has ever matched that night on the Mekong. Sometimes, when I'm processing photos in my studio back in New Zealand, I catch myself listening for the sound of breaking bamboo, half expecting to see those ghost-like stripes materializing from the shadows. The ancient mountain shelter loomed before us, its weathered stone walls nearly black against the darkening sky. Snow was starting to fall, the first of the season. As our group of 4 made our way up the final stretch of the trail in the Transylvanian Alps, the building stood like a sentinel, watching over the valley below, its windows dark and uninviting. We'd been hiking since dawn, following a trail that grew progressively more challenging. As we ascended into the mountains, my friends, all experienced Polish mountaineers, had heard about this shelter from local villagers. They said it was free to use, but the knowing looks they exchanged made me wonder what they weren't telling us. The shelter was a 2-story stone structure, built sometime in the 19th century as a logger's refuge. Before we reached it, we encountered an old forest ranger who was marking trees for winter logging. When we mentioned our destination, he crossed himself and shared a story that made us all uncomfortable. "The old shelter has stood for many winters," he said in broken Polish. "But not all who shelter there find rest." He told us about a logger who died there during a terrible storm in 1923, how his spirit still walks the halls, checking on travelers who seek refuge. The ranger's weathered face grew serious as he added, "If you hear footsteps in the night, do not look. He doesn't like to be seen." The temperature had dropped significantly by the time we reached the shelter. The massive wooden door creaked open with surprising ease, revealing a dusty interior that smelled of old wood and damp stone. The first floor contained a large room with a fireplace, its walls decorated with faded photographs and strange symbols carved into the wooden beams. As we explored the shelter, we found old logging tools mounted on the walls, their metal surfaces dulled with age. The second floor held several small rooms with simple wooden bunks. What caught my attention were the crosses carved into each doorframe, not religious symbols, but crude marks that seemed hastily made. We settled in for the night, starting a fire in the ancient fireplace and preparing a simple meal. The wind outside grew stronger, whistling through gaps in the old stonework. Despite the shelter's somewhat unsettling atmosphere, we were grateful to be out of the weather. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly, though I couldn't say why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow across the room. That's when we heard it, heavy footsteps on the wooden floor above us. Deliberate, methodical, moving from room to room. My friend Merk whispered, "Someone else must have come in from the storm." But we all knew the door was still bolted from the inside, just as we'd left it. The footsteps continued, now accompanied by the sound of something being dragged across the floor. Then came the sound of someone descending the wooden staircase. Each step creaked in succession, slow and purposeful. We sat frozen, watching the doorway that led to the stairs. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in the dim light. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. In the dying firelight, we could make out a dark shape moving through the main room. The figure seemed to be carrying something, an axe or logging tool, that scraped against the floor as it moved. None of us dared to move or speak. The shape moved methodically around the room, as if inspecting each corner, each piece of furniture. When it passed near the fireplace, the embers cast no reflection on it, as if it were made of shadow itself. The footsteps were clear and solid, but the figure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shape moved back toward the stairs. We listened as the footsteps ascended, each stair creaking in the same pattern as before. When they reached the top, silence fell over the shelter once again. Merk's wife, Julia, finally broke the silence, whispering that she had heard stories about the old logger who died here, how he still performs his nightly rounds, checking the shelter and its occupants. The villagers said he was a kind man in life, dedicated to helping lost travelers, and continued his work even after death. We didn't sleep much after that. When dawn finally broke, we discovered something unsettling. Our boots, which we'd left scattered by the door, had been neatly arranged in pairs. Our wet clothes, hung haphazardly near the fire the night before, were now perfectly folded on a nearby bench. As we packed to leave, the old forest ranger appeared again. Seeing our pale faces, he nodded knowingly. The old logger, he takes care of his shelter, and those who stay here, he said, but he prefers to do his work undisturbed. We hurried down the mountain, grateful for the morning light. I've stayed in many mountain shelters since then, but none have left such an impression. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls, I remember those footsteps and wonder about the dedicated soul who still performs his rounds, caring for weary travelers even after death. The midnight sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the Norwegian tundra. I'd been hiking in Jotunheimen National Park for 5 days, documenting Arctic flora for my research. As a Finnish botanist, I was used to solitude, but something about these mountains felt different. The locals spoke of ancient spirits that wandered the peaks during the white nights, when darkness never truly fell. My first encounter with him happened near a crystalline mountain lake. He appeared normal enough at first tall, dressed in expensive hiking gear, carrying professional camera equipment. He introduced himself as Eric, a nature photographer from Stockholm, but something felt off about his movements, his speech, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. We talked briefly about photography and hiking routes. He spoke with an odd cadence, as if carefully choosing each word from a mental script. When I mentioned the rare Arctic flowers I was studying, his eyes lit up with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Nature holds such fascinating secrets, he said, his voice suddenly hollow. Sometimes it needs help revealing them. I made an excuse about needing to check my camp before nightfall, though in the perpetual daylight of the Arctic summer, nightfall was more concept than reality. He watched me leave with that same fixed smile, his camera hanging unused at his side. That evening, while reviewing my plant specimens at camp, I heard footsteps circling my tent. In the endless twilight, shadows played tricks on the mind, but I was certain I saw a figure moving between the scattered boulders. When I called out, there was no response, just the wind whisking across the tundra and the distant cry of a snowy owl. The next morning, I packed up and moved deeper into the park, following a trail that wound through ancient valleys carved by glaciers. The landscape was stark, but beautiful lichen-covered rocks, patches of hardy wildflowers, and the occasional Arctic fox darting between the rocks. 6 hours into my hike, I stopped to photograph a rare specimen of Arctic poppy. That's when I saw him again, Eric, standing motionless on a distant ridge. His camera pointed directly at me. When I raised my hand in greeting, he didn't respond. He simply continued watching through his lens. I quickened my pace, choosing a route that descended into a rocky valley. The white nights played havoc with my sense of time, but I hiked for what must have been hours. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of him on parallel ridges, always at the same distance, always watching. That evening, I made camp near a group of German hikers, hoping their presence would discourage any unwanted visitors. Around midnight, under the perpetual twilight, one of them pointed out a figure standing on the ridge above our camp. "He's been there for hours," she said, "just watching." When they tried to wave him down, he disappeared into the rocks. I hardly slept that night. The sound of footsteps and camera shutters kept me alert. Though when I peered out of my tent, I saw only shifting shadows among the stones. By morning, all the memory cards in my camera had been formatted, erasing 3 days of valuable research photos. Nothing else was touched. The 3rd day, I decided to end my expedition early. As I made my way back toward the ranger station, the sightings became more frequent. Eric would appear ahead of me on the trail, then somehow be behind me minutes later, always with that same fixed smile, always watching through his camera. The strange calls started in the afternoon, perfect imitations of bird songs, but with subtle wrongness that made my skin crawl. They seemed to come from all directions at once, moving with me as I walked. The white night stretched on, the sun rolling along the horizon, but never setting, leaving me in a constant state of twilight that made distance and time feel meaningless. I finally reached the ranger station well past midnight, though the sky was still light enough to see clearly. The ranger listened to my story with growing concern, especially when I described Eric and his camera. "We've had similar reports," she said, pulling out an incident log. "Always during the white nights, always a photographer. But the descriptions span 50 years. The equipment changes, but the behavior remains the same." She showed me a collection of old photographs turned in by hikers over the years. Each showed the same figure watching from distant ridges. But the camera equipment evolved from old box cameras to modern DSLRs. In every image, the figure stood at exactly the same angle, casting impossible shadows that didn't match the direction of the sun. I've returned to Jotunheimen since then, but never during the white nights. The locals say that's when the boundary between worlds grows thin, when those who watch from the other side can step through. They warn visitors not to look too long through cameras during these times. You never know what might be looking back through the lens. Sometimes, when I'm processing my research photos late at night, I think I catch glimpses of him in the background, a tall figure with a camera, standing at that same angle, waiting to capture something that should remain hidden. I've learned to turn off my computer when that happens. Some things, after all, are better left unobserved. The Masai Mara stretched endlessly before me, its golden grasses swaying in the afternoon breeze. As a wildlife researcher from South Africa, I'd spent years studying lion behavior, but this assignment was different. The local Maasai had reported unusual pride behavior in this area, lions appearing and disappearing mysteriously, hunting in patterns that defied natural behavior. I'd set up my research camp strategically, hidden in a grove of acacia trees, overlooking a frequently used hunting ground. My equipment was state-of-the-art. Motion-triggered cameras, infrared sensors, and audio recording devices scattered across my study area. Kimani, my Maasai guide, helped me position everything according to traditional animal paths, though he seemed uneasy about some of the locations. The elders say this place is watched by the spirits. He told me one evening, his eyes reflecting the campfire. They say some areas are not meant for our eyes. I smiled politely, used to local superstitions after years of field work. My equipment would tell the scientific story. I was sure. The first few days were productive. My cameras captured typical lion behavior, hunting, resting, pride interactions. But on the fourth night, things changed. I woke to strange sounds, not animal calls, but something like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. When I emerged from my tent, the savanna was silent, but different somehow. The air felt charged, like just before a storm. The next morning, I found all my cameras had been repositioned, not damaged or stolen, just moved. Each one turned precisely 45 degrees east. The memory cards were untouched, but every recording from midnight to dawn was corrupted with strange audio interference. Kimani refused to help me reset them. "This is a warning," he said simply. "The guardians do not want us watching here." I explained it was probably animals or wind, but he just shook his head. "Animals don't measure angles," he replied. That night, I stayed awake, my laptop recording feeds from all cameras. Around midnight, the screens began to flicker. Through the static, I saw shapes moving between my cameras, tall, slender figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. They moved with purpose, stopping at each piece of equipment. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed out, determined to catch whoever was tampering with my research. The savanna was bright under the full moon, but completely still. No wind, no animal sounds, not even insects. Then I saw them, 3 figures in traditional Maasai clothing. But something was wrong. They were too tall, their movements too fluid, and when they turned toward me, their eyes reflected the moonlight like cats. I froze, my flashlight beam passing through them as if they were made of smoke. They continued their work, adjusting my equipment with impossibly long fingers. I could hear them speaking in that strange whispered language, seemingly untroubled by my presence. When I finally found my voice and called out, they turned to me in unison. One raised a hand in what might have been greeting or warning, and suddenly my flashlight died. When I looked up again, they were gone. The savannah came alive again, insects chirping, night birds calling, the distant roar of a lion. I ran to my nearest camera setup. The camera was still there, but now it pointed toward an area I hadn't been studying. The next morning, that camera captured the most extraordinary pride behavior I'd ever seen, hunting patterns and social interactions that defied everything we knew about lions. Each repositioned camera revealed similar revelations. Kimani wasn't surprised when I showed him the footage. The Guardians want you to see what they think is important, not what you think is important, he explained. They've watched the lions since before our ancestors walked these lands. Over the next few days, my equipment continued to be adjusted nightly. I stopped fighting it and started studying the areas where my cameras were pointed. The research that emerged was groundbreaking, but my academic papers never mentioned the tall figures who guided my observations. The experience changed how I approach my work. Now, when I set up research sites, I leave offerings of milk and honey, as Kimani taught me. Sometimes I still catch glimpses of those tall figures in my peripheral vision, and my equipment still gets mysteriously adjusted. I've learned to accept these corrections. After all, who am I to argue with observers who have watched these lands since the beginning of time? The strangest part, every full moon, all my cameras turn precisely 45 degrees east, no matter where I place them. And in that direction, I always find exactly what I need to see. The ancient forests surrounding Mount Fuji hold secrets that even locals whisper about. As a third-generation Japanese-American photographer, I'd returned to my ancestral homeland to capture the ethereal beauty of cherry blossoms at night. The locals in the small mountain village where I was staying warned me about venturing into the forest after dark, especially during Hanami season. They said the spirits are most active when the sakura blooms. Before setting out, I visited the local temple to pay my respects. The elderly monk there studied me for a long moment before speaking. The forest remembers all who enter, he said in soft Japanese. When you hear the sound of the shakuhachi in the darkness, do not follow it. Some music is not meant for human ears. I smiled politely, attributing his warning to traditional superstition. After all, I was a modern photographer with top-of-the-line equipment. My plan was to capture the moonlight filtering through the cherry blossoms, creating that magical effect that Japanese artists have tried to capture for centuries. The forest was different at night. The twisted black shapes of ancient trees contrasted sharply with the delicate pink and white cherry blossoms floating in the darkness. My camera caught incredible shots, petals suspended in moonbeams, creating natural mandalas in the night air. It started around midnight. The soft, haunting sound of a bamboo flute drifting through the trees. The music was unlike anything I'd ever heard. A melody that seemed to speak of ancient memories and forgotten paths. My rational mind said it must be another photographer, or maybe a local musician practicing. But something about the sound made the hair on my neck stand up. The music moved through the forest, never staying in one place for long. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn to it, moving deeper into the woods than I'd planned. The cherry blossoms seemed to dance in its wake, swirling in patterns that defied the gentle night breeze. As I followed the sound, I noticed other strange things. The forest had grown unusually quiet. No night birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of my own footsteps seemed to carry. The moonlight created strange shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't, and the cherry trees appeared to bend towards the music. Then I saw him, a figure sitting beneath an ancient cherry tree, playing a shakuhachi. He wore traditional clothing that seemed to shift between solid fabric and cherry blossoms in the moonlight. When I raised my camera, the autofocus couldn't seem to find him, as if he existed somewhere between reality and dream. The figure stopped playing and turned toward me. In the moonlight, I could see that his face was smooth as porcelain, but his eyes held centuries. He spoke in ancient Japanese, words I shouldn't have understood, but somehow did. You seek to capture beauty, but some beauty is meant to remain free. I lowered my camera, and he resumed playing. The music grew stronger, and the cherry blossoms began to swirl around him in impossible patterns. Through my viewfinder, I watched as he slowly dissolved into a swirl of petals, his music becoming one with the wind. When I checked my camera later, none of the photos of him had recorded. Instead, each frame showed only swirling cherry blossoms in the moonlight. But in the background of every image, if you look closely, you can see the shadow of a figure playing a flute, even though I only saw him once. The next morning, I showed the photos to the temple monk. He nodded slowly, unsurprised. "You met the spirit of first songs," he said. "He appears to those who seek beauty with pure hearts, but his music cannot be captured by mortal means." He then showed me ancient scrolls depicting the same figure I'd seen painted centuries ago. The locals now say that on quiet nights during Hanami season, when the moon is full and the cherry blossoms are at their peak, you can still hear the haunting sound of a shakuhachi drifting through the forest. Some young photographers go searching for the mysterious musician, but they never find him. The monk says he chooses his audience, and the music finds those who need to hear it. I've returned to those woods many times since then, but I've never heard the music again. However, sometimes when I'm editing photos of cherry blossoms, I swear I can hear a faint melody playing from somewhere just beyond my hearing. And my photos show impossible swirls of petals dancing in still air. The experience changed how I approach photography. I've learned that some moments aren't meant to be captured, only experienced. Now, when I photograph the cherry blossoms, I first sit quietly and listen. Sometimes, the most beautiful images are the ones that exist only in memory, accompanied by the echo of an ancient song. The slopes of Mount Olympus stretched before us, ancient and imposing in the late summer heat. My father Nikos had brought us to his childhood village for our summer holiday, determined to show his British-raised family the magic of his homeland. The small stone house we'd rented sat precariously on the mountainside, surrounded by olive groves and cypress trees that seemed to touch the clouds. At 12 years old, I was far more interested in the local legends than the breathtaking views. The villagers spoke of the mountain as if it were alive, telling stories of how the gods still walked these peaks during the hottest days of summer, when the air shimmered with heat and the horizon blurred between earth and sky. That fateful night, I woke to the sound of urgent voices outside. The air felt different, thicker, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. Through our bedroom window, I saw my father talking with old Stavros, the village fire watcher, their faces illuminated by an odd orange glow. Alina, my father called, his voice tight with worry. Get your things. Quick now. There was something in his tone that made me move without question. As I grabbed my backpack, I noticed the strange light growing stronger, casting dancing shadows on our walls. From the mountain's higher slopes came a sound I'll never forget. A deep, resonant roar that seemed to shake the very earth. The villagers would later say it was Zeus himself, warning his people to flee. All I knew then was the primal fear it awakened in me. We piled into our old Land Rover, the one my father had insisted on renting despite my mother's protests. The vehicle's ancient engine growled to life as more villagers emerged from their homes, some carrying icons of saints, others clutching family photographs and precious heirlooms. The fire had moved faster than anyone expected. Local legend said that Olympian fires were different. They didn't just burn, they hunted. As we started down the mountain road, I looked back to see flames cresting the ridge above our village, moving like a living thing, reaching out with fingers of fire that seemed to grasp at the trees. The narrow mountain road twisted treacherously before us, barely visible in the smoke-filled darkness. My father drove with the kind of focused intensity I'd never seen before, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every few minutes, burning branches would crash onto the road ahead of us, forcing him to swerve. Through gaps in the smoke, I caught glimpses of other vehicles, villagers, fleeing in ancient trucks and tractors, some carrying entire families in their beds. The exodus felt biblical, as if we were all fleeing the wrath of the old gods themselves. Halfway down the mountain, we encountered Alexandros, the local fire chief, in his battered truck. He flagged us down, shouting over the roar of the flames. "The main road is cut off. You'll have to take the old goat track." My father's face paled. He knew that route, a treacherous path that had claimed lives, even in good weather. The Land Rover shuddered as we turned onto the narrow track. On one side, the mountain rose like a wall. On the other, a sheer drop disappeared into smoke-filled darkness. The heat was intense now, making the metal of the car hot to touch. I could hear my mother praying softly in Greek, words I only half understood. Burning pine, cones rolled down the slope like fiery ammunition, exploding against our vehicle. The air became nearly unbreathable, and my eyes stung from the smoke. Through the haze, I saw something that seemed impossible figures moving through the flames on the slopes above us, tall and radiant, as if the fire couldn't touch them. "The Guardians," my father whispered, crossing himself. "They walk the mountain during fires." I wasn't sure if it was smoke and fear playing tricks on my mind, but I could have sworn I saw them gesture, pointing us toward a side path we would have missed otherwise. We emerged from the smoke near dawn, our Land Rover covered in scorch marks. Its paint bubbled from the heat. The valley below was filled with refugees from the mountain villages, all watching as Mount Olympus burned against the lightning sky. The fire would rage for 3 more days, but somehow not a single life was lost. When we returned to the village a week later, we found our rental house miraculously untouched, though the flames had burned right up to its walls. The old olive tree in the garden still stood, its ancient trunk blackened but alive. At its base, we found a small silver coin of the type used in ancient offerings, its surface untarnished despite the fire. Local firefighters couldn't explain how the blaze had moved so quickly, or why it had suddenly changed direction just before reaching the village center. The old people just nodded knowingly, leaving fresh offerings at the small roadside shrines that dotted the mountain paths. Years later, I still dream of that night, of fire that moved like water, of mysterious figures in the flames, and of the deep, thunderous roar that shook the mountain. My father never rented another Land Rover after that, but whenever we hear thunder, he looks up at the sky and whispers, "Thank you." I've spent 6 years studying orangutans in the rainforests of Borneo, but nothing in my experience prepared me for that night. The locals had warned me about the approaching monsoon, how it would be different from the usual rains. When the great storms come, my guide had said before leaving, even the spirits seek shelter. The research post was an old structure built in the 1970s by Dutch scientists. It stood on stilts among the massive dipterocarp trees, a remnant of earlier scientific expeditions. I'd been tracking a particularly intelligent female orangutan for weeks, documenting unusual tool use that could revolutionize our understanding of primate behavior. When the storm hit, it came with a vengeance that made me understand why the locals spoke of it with such reverence. The rain didn't fall. It exploded from the sky in solid sheets of water. The canopy above, usually an impenetrable green ceiling, began to sway and crack like it was trying to tear itself apart. I was grateful for the solid construction of the old post, its heavy timber frame built to withstand decades of tropical weather. But as the wind grew stronger, the entire structure began to creak and shudder. The rain was so loud on the metal roof that I could barely hear myself think. That's when I saw him, a massive male orangutan, far larger than any I'd documented in my studies. He emerged from the storm like a ghost, his long red fur plastered to his body by the rain, instead of seeking shelter in the trees, as these usually solitary creatures do during storms. He was moving purposefully toward the research post. My first instinct was to reach for my camera, but something about his behavior made me pause. He climbed onto the platform with an almost human deliberateness, and rather than showing the usual cautious fear of human structures, he seemed to know exactly where he was going. The wind was reaching a fever pitch now, howling through the trees with a sound like tortured metal. The orangutan positioned himself near the door, sitting with his back against the wall. His presence was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Here was hundreds of pounds of wild animal, barely 6 feet from me, yet he seemed more focused on the storm than on my presence. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark bursts, and in those flashes, I could see other orangutans in the nearby trees, seeking shelter where they could. But this male was different. Every time a particularly strong gust would hit the post, he would reach out and grab one of the support beams, as if helping to hold the structure in place. The storm grew worse. Trees began to fall in the forest around us, their crashes barely audible over the overwhelming roar of wind and rain. The research post swayed alarmingly, and I was certain we would be torn apart at any moment. The orangutan remained steadfast, occasionally making low vocalizations that seemed to resonate despite the storm's chaos. Most fascinating was his reaction to the other orangutans. Whenever the lightning revealed one struggling in the canopy, he would make a specific sound, not quite like any orangutan call, I'd documented before. The struggling animal would then make its way toward our shelter, finding stable branches near the post. By the height of the storm, we had become an improbable gathering. A human researcher and half a dozen orangutans, all taking shelter together. The big male remained by the door, maintaining his peculiar guard. His eyes, when I could see them in the flashes of lightning, held an intelligence that made me question everything I thought I knew about these creatures. The storm raged for hours. At its worst, when the post threatened to tear free from its foundations, the male orangutan actually moved to the center pole and wrapped his powerful arms around it, bracing himself against the floor and ceiling. His strength, combined with the post's construction, kept us grounded through gusts that were laying waste to the surrounding forest. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to ease, the other orangutans melted away into the damaged forest. The male remained until the sky began to lighten, then turned to look at me directly. In that moment, I felt like I was being seen not as a researcher or even as a human, but as another being who had shared this experience of survival. He left as deliberately as he had arrived, vanishing into the dripping canopy. When I checked my camera later, every photo I tried to take during the night was too blurred by the dark and rain to be useful. The only evidence I had was the deep impressions of his hands in the wooden beam he had gripped through the worst of the storm. The local rangers weren't surprised by my story. They told me about other researchers who had encountered this same orangutan during severe storms, always at the old post. Some believed he was the same male who had been observed by the Dutch researchers decades ago, though that would make him impossibly old. He remembers, the senior ranger told me. Orangutans live here long before the post. They watch us build it. Now he protects it like it protects him. He smiled at my skeptical expression. Not everything in the forest can be explained in scientific papers. I continued my research for another year, documenting remarkable instances of tool use and social behavior in the local orangutan population. But I never saw that particular male again, except during the worst storms, when he would silently emerge from the darkness to take his post by the door, guardian of our shared shelter in the chaos of the monsoon. The Kerry coastline has always held its secrets close, but none more tightly than those kept by the ancient stone circle near Dingle Bay. As a ranger for the National Heritage Parks, I'd spent countless nights camping in remote locations. But this was different. The ruins stood stark against the twilight sky, their weathered stones holding memories of rituals performed thousands of years ago. My friend Siobhan, an archaeologist studying the site, had convinced me to help her document unusual light patterns during Samhain. What most people now know as Halloween Eve. The local pub owner had raised his eyebrows when we mentioned our plans over a pint of Guinness that afternoon. "The old stones remember," he'd said, wiping a glass with methodical precision. "They remember when the veil was thinner, when the other crowd walked freely." He wouldn't elaborate further, just shook his head and moved to serve another customer. We set up camp in a sheltered hollow, about 50 yards from the stone circle. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the salt smell of the Atlantic mixed with the sweet decay of fallen leaves. Siobhan had arranged her scientific equipment, cameras, light meters, and various sensors, while I got our campfire going. The old shepherd who grazed his sheep nearby had watched us from a distance all afternoon, finally approaching at sunset. "You'll be wanting to pack up before dark," he'd suggested, his weathered face serious. "Some nights, especially this night, aren't meant for watching." But we were modern women, more concerned with scientific observation than ancient superstitions. As darkness fell, a peculiar stillness settled over the landscape. The constant sound of waves against the cliffs became muted, as if something was dampening all noise. Even our fire seemed to burn lower, its flames an unnatural blue at the edges. Around midnight, both of us felt it. A sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the autumn night. The air grew thick, like honey trying to flow through water. A weight pressed against my chest, making each breath feel like a deliberate act. Siobhan's instruments began malfunctioning one by one, their digital displays flickering and dying. The temperature gauge registered impossible readings before going dark. Our campfire dimmed to barely glowing embers, though we just added fresh wood. That's when we heard it music, but not like anything I'd ever encountered. It seemed to come from within the stones themselves, a low humming that resonated in my bones. Siobhan grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. Neither of us spoke. We couldn't. The moonlight took on a strange quality, casting shadows that moved independent of any objects. Between the ancient stones, the air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The humming grew stronger, and with it came an overwhelming sense of being watched. I felt at first an ancient, heavy presence that pressed against my consciousness like a weight. When I looked at Siobhan, I knew she felt it too. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with recognition of something her scientific mind couldn't process. The space between the stones rippled, and through that ripple came a sound that might have been voices, might have been wind, might have been the memory of 10,000 years of ritual and remembrance. The shadows between the stones began to move with purpose, taking shapes that almost made sense before dissolving back into darkness. Without discussing it, we both began backing toward our car. The pressure in the air grew stronger with each step, as if whatever dwelled among the stones didn't want us to leave, or perhaps was warning us to do exactly that. When we reached the car, we didn't stop to pack up our equipment. The presence among the stones had become almost physical, and the humming had risen to a pitch that made my teeth ache. We drove away with our headlights cutting through an unnaturally thick fog that hadn't been there minutes before. The next morning, when we returned for our equipment, everything was exactly as we'd left it, except all of Siobhan's instruments had been carefully arranged in the center of the stone circle, each one positioned with mathematical precision to align with the cardinal points. The scientific data they'd collected was completely erased. The old shepherd was there, watching us pack up. "The stones remember," he said, echoing the pub owner's words. "They remember when they were more than stone, when they sang with power. Sometimes, especially on Samhain, they remember enough to remind us too." Siobhan's official report mentioned equipment malfunction due to unexpected electromagnetic interference. She's now studying ancient Celtic astronomical alignments, approaching the old stones with a newfound respect for what she calls traditional observational methods. I still work as a ranger, but I never camp near stone circles anymore, especially not on Samhain. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is right, I can still feel that weight in the air, still hear that otherworldly humming. The old stones do remember, and on certain nights, they're kind enough to warn away those who aren't ready for their memories. The thin air at 16,000 feet made every breath feel like a conscious effort. I'd been photographing the Himalayas for National Geographic for years, but this expedition was different. My wife Maria, a botanist, had heard rumors of an extremely rare flower that bloomed only once every 12 years on these remote Tibetan plateaus. The locals called it Buddha's tear, and finding it could make both our careers. Our group was small but experienced. Maria and I, our Sherpa guide Pemba, and 2 other researchers. We'd established our base camp near an ancient monastery, its prayer flags whipping in the constant wind. The monks had been welcoming, but reserved, warning us through Pemba that this was a sacred time, the period when the mountain spirits were most active. The strange encounters began on our 3rd day. I was photographing a patch of blue poppies when I noticed him. A monk standing perfectly still about 50 yards away, his maroon robes moving oddly in the wind. Something about his stillness felt unnatural, even at that altitude, where every movement was deliberate. His immobility seemed to defy human limitations. He approached with that same unnatural smoothness, as if gliding rather than walking. His face was young, but his eyes held an ancient quality that made my skin crawl. When he spoke, his voice had an odd, echoing quality, as if coming from somewhere far away. "What do you seek in the holy places?" he asked in perfect English, though Pemba had told us none of the local monks spoke the language. Before I could answer, he smiled a gesture that never reached those ancient eyes, and added, "Some flowers bloom only in darkness." The encounter left me unsettled, but I was determined to continue our work. That evening, while reviewing my photos, I noticed something odd. The monk didn't appear in any of them, though I'd captured several frames of that location. Later that night, the temperature dropped dramatically. The wind died completely unusual for these heights, and an unnatural silence fell over our camp. Maria woke me, her face pale in the moonlight. "Listen," she whispered. In the absolute stillness, we could hear someone walking around our tent, but the footsteps sounded wrong, too light for the crunch of rocky soil, yet clearly audible. Our gear outside shifted and moved, though there was no wind. Through the tent wall, I could see a figure moving with that same impossible smoothness I'd witnessed earlier. We sat frozen, barely breathing, as the figure circled our tent 7 times, a number sacred in Buddhist tradition. Then everything went still. The silence became oppressive, pressing against our ears like a physical force. Maria clutched my arm, pointing to the tent ceiling. A face was pressing against the fabric from above, at a height impossible for someone standing on the ground. The fabric distorted the features, but I recognized those ancient eyes. I fumbled for my headlamp, but when I switched it on, the face was gone. The wind returned with sudden violence, and our tent shook with its force. In the morning, we found all our camera memory cards had been wiped clean, except for one image. A close-up of a stunning flower none of us had photographed. Its petals an impossible shade of midnight blue. Pemba's face went white when we showed him the photo. He spoke rapidly with some monks who had come to check on us. "They say this is the Buddha's tear," he translated hesitantly, "but it blooms only in the spirit realm. No living person has ever photographed it." The strange monk appeared one more time, just before dawn on our final day. I was awake, unable to sleep, when he stepped out of the darkness near our tent. This time he moved normally, and his eyes looked human. "You have been shown what you came to see," he said, "but some knowledge is not meant to be taken, only experienced." He reached into his robes and pulled out my primary camera, which had been locked in my tent, and placed it carefully on a rock. When I looked down to check it, he vanished. The camera contained a single photo. Our entire campsite from an impossible aerial angle, showing all of us asleep in our tents, as if photographed from hundreds of feet above. Later, we learned that the monastery had been empty for days. All the monks had descended to the valley for a special ceremony. When we described our monk to the monastery's head lama, he listened intently before showing us an ancient scroll. On it was a drawing of a figure identical to our visitor. identified as the guardian of sacred places, a spirit that appears to those who seek divine knowledge with pure hearts but misguided methods. The photo of the Buddha's tear disappeared from our memory cards during the flight home, and all attempts to recover it failed. Maria's scientific papers now focus on traditional botanical knowledge and the importance of preserving sacred spaces. I still photograph mountains, but I always leave an offering at the base of my tripod, a habit I picked up after that night. Sometimes, when I'm developing photos from high places, I catch glimpses of a maroon-robed figure in the background, standing at impossible angles on sheer cliffs. I've learned not to look too closely at these images. Some mysteries, as the monk suggested, are meant to be experienced rather than captured. The air at 20,000 feet has a way of playing tricks with your mind. I'd climbed most of the world's major peaks, but Mount Kailash was different. The Tibetans call it the navel of the world. And after what happened that morning, I understand why some places are best left to the gods. My guide, Tenzin, had warned me about attempting the final ascent during the full moon. The mountain shows itself differently when the barriers between worlds are thin, he'd said, his weathered face serious in the firelight. But I was an experienced Norwegian climber with summit fever, too focused on my goal to heed ancient warnings. We started our climb at 3 in the morning, hoping to reach the ridge by sunrise. The moon hung impossibly large in the thin air, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. At that altitude, every step was a conscious effort, every breath a deliberate battle against the oxygen-starved atmosphere. The first signs that something was different came around 18,000 feet. The moonlight began to fragment, creating rainbow halos that shouldn't have been possible in the dark. Tenzin noticed it too, muttering prayers under his breath as he checked our ropes for the 100th time. As we approached the ridge, the air grew strange, thicker somehow. Despite the altitude, the moonlight seemed to pool in hollows of snow, creating luminous patches that pulsed with an inner light. My oxygen-deprived brain struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. The boundaries between snow, sky, and rock began to blur. Then we saw it, the Brock Inspector, a rare phenomenon where climbers see their own shadows projected onto clouds, surrounded by rainbow rings. But this was different. The figure in the clouds wasn't mimicking our movements. It stood perfectly still, impossibly large, its edges shifting between human and something else entirely. The thin air was really affecting me now. Each breath felt like inhaling frozen fire. The world began to tilt and spin, the mountain itself seeming to breathe beneath our feet. Tenzin's voice came to me as if from underwater, warning about our oxygen levels. But I was transfixed by the figure in the clouds. As the first rays of sun breached the horizon, the specter began to move, not like a shadow, but like a living thing, its movements ancient and deliberate. The rainbow rings around it started spinning, creating patterns that seemed to contain entire universes. I found myself understanding why the Tibetans believe this mountain to be the axis of the world. My oxygen-starved mind was floating free now, caught between hallucination and something that felt more real than reality itself. The figure in the clouds turned toward us, and in that moment, I saw faces within faces, gods and demons, past and future, all swirling together in a cosmic dance. Tenzin was shaking me, his voice urgent. Our oxygen was critically low, but I couldn't look away. The spirit of the mountain, I can't think of it any other way, raised its massive hand. The gesture was clear. Go back. This place was not meant for human eyes. What happened next still haunts my dreams. The entire mountain seemed to shift, reality bending like light through a prism. I saw other climbers, not modern mountaineers, but people from every age of history, all attempting the same ascent. Some were dressed in ancient garb, others in futuristic gear I didn't recognize. All of them turned back at this exact spot, understanding something I was only beginning to grasp. The sun rose fully, and with it came a wind that cut through our layers like they were tissue paper. The spectral figure dissolved, but not before I saw it smile, a gesture that contained both infinite compassion and absolute finality. This was as far as we were meant to go. Our descent was a blur of oxygen deprivation and spiritual overload. By the time we reached base camp, my rational mind was already trying to explain away what we'd seen: altitude sickness, atmospheric phenomena, ice crystals in the air. But Tenzin's face told a different story. At the monastery that evening, the old lama nodded as we recounted our experience. The mountain shows each climber what they need to see, he said. Some see gods, some see their own limitations. The wise ones learn to recognize when they're seeing both. I never attempted Kailash's summit again. Some mountains, I've learned, aren't meant to be conquered. They exist as reminders that there are places in this world where the physical and spiritual realms touch, where the boundaries we take for granted dissolve like morning mist. Now, when I see climbers posting summit selfies on Instagram, I think about that figure in the clouds, about the infinite faces I saw within it. Some summits are worth reaching, not because you can plant your flag there, but because they teach you why you shouldn't. The ancient forests of Hokkaido hold secrets that my Japanese grandmother used to whisper about during long winter nights in California. As a documentary filmmaker, I'd traveled the world capturing strange phenomena, but this project felt different. We were here to document the yukai, the spirit creatures of Japanese folklore during Aben, when the boundary between worlds grows thin. Our small crew consisted of myself, my sound engineer Tom, and Kenji, our local guide who'd grown up near these woods. The old Shinto priest at the forest shrine had been hesitant to grant us permission to film. The camera lens sees too clearly sometimes, he'd warned, burning incense and marking our equipment with protective symbols. The forest welcomed us with an unsettling silence. Despite the autumn season, there were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that made our equipment sound unnaturally loud. Kenji led us to a clearing marked by stone lanterns, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of rain and snow. Our first strange encounter happened during equipment setup. The batteries in all our cameras drained simultaneously, despite being fully charged. When we replaced them, the viewfinders showed bizarre light anomalies, streaming ribbons of color that were invisible to the naked eye. As dusk approached, the forest transformed. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating tunnels of shadow that shifted when viewed directly. Our microphones picked up whispered conversations in ancient Japanese. Though we were miles from any village, Tom, reviewing the audio, went pale when he isolated one clear phrase. "They are watching through the glass eye." That night, setting up our base camp, we followed Kenji's instructions meticulously. Salt circles, sacred rope, and small offerings of rice and sake at the cardinal points. The old priest had insisted on these precautions, though we'd initially seen them as quaint superstitions. Around midnight, our cameras began triggering automatically. The motion sensors detected movement everywhere, yet we could see nothing. Reviewing the footage in real time, we caught glimpses of impossible things, faces in the bark of trees, shapes that defied natural law, beings that seemed to shift between human and animal form. The temperature dropped dramatically, and our breath frosted in the air, despite the relatively warm autumn night. Through my camera's viewfinder, I saw something emerge from behind a distant tree, a figure in traditional dress, but wrong somehow. Its movements were too fluid, its proportions slightly off, as if something was wearing the idea of a human form rather than actually being human. The figure approached our camp, stopping at the salt line. Through the camera, I could see its face clearly ancient, beautiful, and terrifying in its inhumanity. It spoke, its voice containing multiple tones simultaneously. You seek to capture what is not meant to be seen. The lens reveals too much. Suddenly, every piece of electronic equipment we had erupted in static. Through the cacophony, we heard distinct voices speaking in various Japanese dialects, some so ancient that even Kenji couldn't understand them. The figure raised its hand, and our cameras began to show impossible images, scenes from different time periods, glimpses of creatures that defied description, visions that made my mind recoil. Tom screamed. His headphones were smoking, and blood trickled from his ears. The figure turned toward him, its face shifting through multiple forms. "The ears that hear too much must be cleansed," it said, in that multi-toned voice. Tom collapsed, though his vital signs remained stable. Kenji began chanting, not the Shinto prayers he'd been taught, but something older, something that seemed to come from deep within his ancestral memory. The figure paused, tilting its head at an impossible angle. "The old words are remembered," it said, sounding almost pleased. "Perhaps not all is forgotten." Everything electronic in our camp died simultaneously. In the absolute darkness that followed, we heard movement all around us, sliding, shuffling, whispering sounds that spoke of countless hidden presences. When we finally managed to light an emergency lantern, we found ourselves surrounded by offerings, small stones, ancient coins, fragments of pottery that Kenji later identified as belonging to periods centuries past. Tom recovered by morning, though he could no longer remember any of the sounds he'd heard that night. Our cameras were functional again, but every frame of footage had been erased, replaced with a single image, a written warning in classical Japanese. Some things are meant to be remembered, not recorded. The old priest wasn't surprised by our experience. The yokai protect their mysteries, he explained. They let you see enough to remember why some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. He then showed us century-old temple records describing identical encounters, cameras damaged, recordings erased, witnesses left with memories they couldn't quite explain. I still make documentaries, but I'm more cautious now about what I try to capture on film. Sometimes, late at night, while editing footage, I catch glimpses of that figure in the background of unrelated shots. A reminder that some things can observe us through our own lenses. I've learned to turn off the camera when that happens. Some stories, after all, are meant to be passed down in whispers, not captured in pixels.
Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.